Dominus vobiscum. Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Matteum. At the sight of the crowds, the heart of Jesus was moved with pity. They were lying prostrate from exhaustion like sheep without a shepherd. He said to his disciples, "The harvest is good, but laborers are scarce. Beg the harvest master to send out laborers to gather his harvest." Then he summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority to expel unclean spirits and cure sickness and disease of every kind. The names of the 12 apostles were these: first, Simon, now known as Peter, and his brother Andrew; James, Zebedee's son, and his brother John; Philip and Bartholomew; Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector; James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus; Simon the zealot party member, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Jesus sent these men on missions as the 12 after giving them the following instructions: "Do not visit pagan territory and do not enter a Samaritan town. Go instead after the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, make this announcement: the reign of God is at hand. Cure the sick, raise the dead, heal the leprous, expel demons. The gift you have received, give as a gift." The Verbum Domini. Let us all be seated. Today is the 11th Sunday in Ordinary Time. We have finished the Feast of Pentecost, wherein we learn how the Catholic Church looked like and how to enter the Catholic Church. And for each one of us, it is important that we learn, that we know how the church looks like, and we should know whether we are inside or still outside the Catholic Church. As we have seen before, the steps in attaining our salvation are 4 steps. First, repentance; second, faith; third, hope; and the fourth is charity. We enter the Catholic Church and assure our salvation on the second step, faith. And so in the Gospels for the past Sundays up to now, all of them were taken from chapter 9 of the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel writer is showing us all the signs that we are inside the Catholic Church, in which case, if we have the opposite, then that would be a sign that we are outside. Chapter 9 of St. Matthew narrates, for instance, many cures. And every time Christ would cure, he would say, "Your faith has saved you." So notice that faith and salvation goes hand in hand. That when you believe, when you have faith, That's the time you enter the Catholic Church, you are at the same time saved. So these are the signs. So miracles performed by Christ. There was a miracle of the woman who had hemorrhage, who was bleeding, who simply touched the hem of the clothes of Christ, and Christ says, "Your faith has saved you." It was not touching Christ that saved her. It was her faith. At the beginning of creation, God created us, and He wanted us to go to heaven. But before we could go to heaven, God had to fashion us to be capable of withstanding the beauty and the greatness of the vision of God in heaven. And so God had to fortify us with an intellect and a free will. We need those two, to know God and to love God. But at the same time, God gave us graces, because that intellect and that free will would not withstand the greatness of God without graces. And so God, after giving Adam and Eve and all men an intellect and a free will, gave them a test. The test is to find out whether they deserve the grace that will enable them to view the beatific vision. Without that grace, you cannot. And so a test was given to them, in which God says, "I'm you, your Lord. I am your God. You must subject your intellect and your free will to me." So what God is trying to say is, you must act like perfect servants. And the gospel is filled with parables about the master and the servants, because we must be perfect servants, with the hope that when we are perfect servants, we would be promoted to good friends. And then if we are good friends, we would be promoted to children of God. But we must begin as perfect servants. Now, what did Adam and Eve do? And what did Lucifer did? They refused to subject their minds and their free wills to God. Just like the prodigal son who said, "Father, give me my inheritance." That's the mind and the free will. So I can go to a far country and use them the way I want. I do not want to subject my mind and free will to you, my Father, in this house. I want to go out and use it the way I want. Like what all children do today when they are of age. They want to leave their homes because they refuse to subject themselves to their parents. That is original sin. And so all men were born refusing to subject themselves to God. When a person subjects himself to God, he develops virtues. When a person refuses to subject himself, he develops vices. The sign that you are a virtuous person is that you are obedient. The sign that you are a vicious person is you are disobedient. All good actions that will make us deserving to go to heaven come from virtues. All sins that will make us deserve to go to hell comes from vices. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, which is the Gospel since after Pentecost up to now, Holy Mother, the Church has been showing us what are the signs that you are inside the Catholic Church, that you have faith. And the Gospel specifically enumerates two virtues, that is chastity and self-abnegation or temperance. Temperance is a form of chastity, which was shown in the example of the apostles and the opposite example of the three young men who refused the invitation of Christ. Let us look briefly at the apostles. Now, notice that virtues consist in loving God first. Well, that's the command of Christ, to love God first. Then to love your neighbors secondly. And then thirdly, to love everything else, the rest. Thirdly. Now, vices is when you invert the order, when you love first your neighbors, or you love worldly things before God. Now, let's see if the apostles who are now enumerated in today's gospel, who made the core member of the Catholic Church, showing they had faith, and now they have to reach hope and charity. Let's see if they had it. Look how Christ tested them. The first, whether they would prefer material things to God. If they were virtuous, they would prefer God first. If they were sinners, they would prefer material things first. And so Peter was asked, Peter, follow me and leave your boats and nets. It was a choice between God and the third, objects, things in the world. And Peter chose God and followed him, leaving his boat and his nets. You have to leave it first for you to pass the test. Now let's look at the young rich man. Christ says, follow me, and he was rich. What did he choose? Did he choose Christ or his riches? He followed his riches, and therefore he had vices. He went against God. He was not able to enter the church. So the same thing with Matthew. In the gospel of the past Sunday, he was told by Christ, come, follow me. Choose between me and your family. And Matthew chose Christ without even visiting his family to say goodbye. He made a good choice. It shows he had virtues. Let's look at the young man. The young man was invited by Christ, come follow me. And the young man says, let me go home first to my family and say goodbye. He chose to go to his family and say goodbye. It showed vices and not virtues. So he was outside the Catholic Church. So you will see, therefore, that virtue is simply making the right choices in the right order, while vices are making choices in the wrong order. Now, there is nothing wrong in saying goodbye to your family as long as you choose God first. There is nothing wrong with using what you possess as long as you love God first. But before you can safely say goodbye to your family and safely use the things of this world, you have to prove, not to God, but to yourselves, that you first love God by following God and living everything first. And so, the sign that we are inside the Catholic Church is obedience. What's the sign that you're outside? Disobedience. One who is inside is always obedient to everything that Christ had commanded. Those who are outside may be obedient to 1 or 3 commands, but are disobedient to many other commandments or desires of Christ. And so what Christ is saying is this: if you cannot leave all things to follow Christ, if you cannot leave your relations, your family, to follow Christ, because you are the type that is guilty of that great heresy of Protestantism that says, I want to have my cake and eat it too. Meaning to say, we would like to follow Christ and enjoy the world at the same time. We would like to follow Christ and possess material things at the same time. We would like to follow Christ and say hello and goodbye to our families at the same time. It cannot be. You have to make a choice. That is the test, to make a choice. And therefore, as long as we cannot leave our things in the world, we cannot avoid saying hello, goodbye, happy birthday, and so on like that. It's almost a clear sign we are outside the Catholic Church. We do not have faith. We are not yet good members of the Christian community. And so the gospel for today ends by which Christ tells us that, again, he says, to enter the Catholic Church, you must show no signs of greed. There must be nothing in this world that you prefer to Christ. That's greed. You prefer worldly things to Christ. Then he says, you must not also have impure desires. You see, when you love your neighbor before God, that is an impure relationship. A husband and a wife might naturally love each other, but the moment they love each other before God, that becomes fornication. When you love your children before God, St. Thomas called this the sin of incest. Very serious sins. And why? Because you inverted the order. So Christ shows us the importance of doing things in the proper order when he says, okay, now, you are the 12 apostles, you have faith, you are inside the church, now go and bring other people inside the church and follow strictly this order. Preach first to the Jews and then later on to the Gentiles. So you see, there is order. First preach to the Jews, then the Gentiles. First love God, and then your neighbors. Virtue is the source of whole happiness. Vices are the sources of all misery. The trouble with vices is the more miserable you are, the more you run after more vices in the hope that these new vices would make you happy. not learning the lesson that it is vices that makes you miserable. On the other hand, when you have virtues, everything makes you happy. And when you see that acts of virtues makes you happy, your tendency is to perform more and more acts of virtues that would make you happier and happier until such time that you have performed all virtues, and all virtues make the virtue of charity, by which now you truly love God and your neighbors. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.